Hello friends, we're here today in Hebrews chapter 5. So this section kind of started in the last chapter where it's talking about the high priest, the great high priest. You know, Jesus is greater than the high priest in more ways than one. But the first one that it mentions is the fact that Jesus is sinless. You know, basically, every other high priest had to make sacrifices for himself. But Jesus was sinless. And it should be said that every high priest leading up to now is really just meant to be a picture of what Jesus is. He's the one who speaks on our behalf to God. He is the mediator between mankind and God. And the priest was a picture of that, but he wasn't the real thing. So Jesus was sinless. And so all the other priests, they had to make sacrifices for themselves. What's interesting is that Jesus is the priest, but he's also the sacrifice. There was an order of priesthood, and it came through a family. You know, if you were a priest back then, you were in the order of Aaron or of Levi. That means that your priesthood was handed down to you. You know, it was an order that was given to you by this line that God created. And they might look at it and say, well, Jesus was not part of this line. You know, Jesus wasn't a Levite. He wasn't a descendant of Aaron. And this points out that no, he wasn't. He's not in the order of Aaron. He's not a Levite. But he was in the order of somebody else. And it mentions him. And we're going to be talking about this, and the chapter is up and coming. But Jesus is a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. You might be thinking, who's Melchizedek? You know, in Genesis, it talks about Melchizedek. And so I won't say everything that I want to say about Melchizedek because he's coming up in chapter 7. And so I get to talk about him then more. But I'll just give you a brief synopsis of who Melchizedek is. When Abraham was going to fight a war, you know, he came to a place called Salem. Now, I think it should be said that when we look at where he lived and where he was going, that the place that is called Salem was probably Jerusalem. It was Jerusalem. It was the same place. You know, that David was the king. And it should be said that this mention of Melchizedek is really a quote from David in the Psalms. David knew something. He knew that before him, when King Saul was in charge, he was going to go into battle, and he was waiting for the priest to make a sacrifice so that they would have, you know, God's favor as they go into battle. And the priest wasn't there to make the sacrifice. So Saul decided, well, if the priest isn't here, I'll just make the sacrifice myself. And this was a big mistake. You know, this might have been, you know, the beginning of Saul's downfall, because the priest is not allowed to be the king. The king is one thing, the priest is another thing. He's telling Saul, God is telling Saul, you are not the priest king. You cannot be the priest king. However, when we look at Melchizedek, he is the king of Jerusalem, and he also gave the sacrifice to Abraham, someone that came before. And he recognized him as a priest of the Most High God, and he was able to be the priest and the king. So that's what Jesus is. He essentially is something that predates the Levitical priesthood. He is greater. I mean, I guess that's the idea behind the whole chapter, is that he is greater than the high priest because he is in the order of Melchizedek. Well, I love what it says at the end of this chapter. It says that Jesus, through his obedience, was able to endure all the hardships of life and of death. He was able to go through this life and die for us, feeling all of the same pain, feeling all of the same temptations of us. He went through essentially everything that we went through, but he did it with such obedience, and he did it with such perfection, and he did it without sin. He was the perfect sacrifice. He was the perfect king. He was the perfect prince. He was all three mixed up in one. And I love that, with that picture of what Saul was trying to do. He was trying to be the priest and the king, but Jesus is the priest and the king and the sacrifice. He is so much better than the current high priest. It makes me think of that song, upon the throne of God above, I have a strong and perfect plea, a great high priest whose name is love, whoever lives and pleads for me. I'll stop right there, but that's a great song. So anyways, that is Hebrews chapter 5. Have a great day. Bye.